Hello and welcome everybody to another lecture. I changed the venue here. I thought to bring it outside warm, but it definitely feels pretty good. Let's get into what I found to be a very stimulating piece, Barbara Ehrenreich's War Without Humans, Modern Bloodrites Revisited. I need to read more of this individual because I just feel like she's talking about a lot of topics that don't get a lot of publicity, get a lot of airtime. If you turn on any of the news, especially the mainstream media, you don't see a lot of talk about what's going on with U.S. Foreign policy, military involvement in other nations, only when it seems like there really has to be headlines. Are there headlines? A lot of stuff is kind of kept out of the spotlight, but she kind of digs into it, and she sometimes makes she reminds us of some facts that still kind of come across as like ideas because there's been so little talk about some of these events. But anyways, getting into it here, what she'll speak to over the course of this essay is just the changing foundations of how wars are waged by superpowers in the increasing advanced AI systems and robotic systems that are becoming a reality. In the assignments I talked about Metal Gear, the video game, and I just remember playing that and seeing the crazy kind of robotic things that would be a part of the battles, and I would think, you think at that point it's quite the imagination of these video game designers to come up with these things, but no, this really is kind of where robotics is headed, and you can look online at some YouTube videos of some highly esteemed companies. I think Boston Dynamics is one of them. I should know more off the top of my head. I know another one because I know somebody who works for it. FLIR, F-L-I-R, is another robotics, and a lot of this, you talk about the grant money they get, and the funding is going to be for military systems. A lot of groundbreaking innovation is done at the military level and is subsidized heavily by the American taxpayer nonetheless. So a lot of this is happening, and we're seeing major ways now in which robotics AI is becoming a part of the battlefield, right? Okay. She reminds us a kind of little bit of a kind of history of nation states, about how war eventually becomes something that's dealt with on an administrative level for governments and kingdoms that kind of turn into governments that have more of a kind of social presence than just monarchies and such. So they've always kind of commanded this type of power, right? Okay, very good. They can tax, they can conscript, they can do these things and have a monopoly over war, and that's the way it's been for a long time, probably since the 1400s, as far as I understand, in the European world. We have a new threat, and she gets into it. She talks about Al-Qaeda. She talks about the Taliban. Again, I think these are tough topics for some Americans and for some American news agencies, it seems, to want to talk about, and she kind of gets into it. What she says is, so much spam, so I apologize for that. What she gets into right away is this description of the threat has essentially changed. We aren't waging, as the American government, the American military is not waging war against countries in particular, though that day may not be coming. Here we are in the year 2019. You look into these things, but more or less terrorist groups who find havens and are operating out of, directly or indirectly, these different countries throughout these different regions of the Middle East. So the target is always moving, right? Now I can add to that, because I've also heard from a kind of media kind of standpoint, in terms of, I guess you could say, propaganda, try to get us to accept this ongoing war against terrorism, especially terrorism that seems to spring out of the Middle East in that context. If the media can, and again, the media is sometimes, operates with conjunction with the CIA and the Pentagon and kind of, intelligence officials, you can make the target always on the move, right? So, how Americans don't necessarily feel comfortable with war against a particular country, right? When we think of it in those terms, but if it's just fighting terrorist groups here and there, because that's just where the terrorist groups are, we have this elusive, always changing target. Well, maybe it's something that's more palpable for us as the American people. We can kind of stomach that. So there's also, there's that added kind of propagandic way that can be used. Now, the point that she makes about the kind of changing nature of the enemy, and of course I put that in quotation marks, is that it's making it harder for the military to deal with these types of terrorist groups as well, right? It's a changing enemy, therefore the military is kind of probably going to have to consider some change as well. Now, what I love about this is, and I do have a printed copy, but the paragraph beginning, consider the most recent U.S. war with Iraq, she is kind of dating the piece, of course. We're going back in time a bit, but I think some people have to be reminded of this. And I'll just read, the casual link between the event and our chosen enemy, Iraq, was, however, imperceptible to all but the most dedicated inside the Beltway intellectuals. A lot of people still don't know the truth of that day, 9/11. If you were to ask, well, who was in the planes? Who hijacked those planes? Who were those individuals? There is almost this ignorance that you do run into on some level. In fact, maybe even you didn't know this before reading the piece, but I had to be reminded, of course. I knew it. But it was Saudi Arabian individuals, right, who are linked, of course, to the Saudi Arabian, military, government intelligence, stuff like that. So there was already kind of a more interesting link there. Why is that kind of crazy that it was Saudi Arabian individuals? Well, look at our relationship and our alliance, essentially, with Saudi Arabia today, strong as ever, because they buy billions of dollars worth of weapons from us, fighters, missiles, you name it. So it's strange, right? And it just kind of opens up new questions. And I think if you talk to some people about 9/11, that's their biggest gripe, is that there are these unanswered questions about that day. Whether they be significant questions or insignificant questions, or warranted questions or not so warranted questions, there are questions that remain and some people want answers, but the media doesn't seem to give any of that attention. There's no real investigative journalism in that particular direction. Okay, very good. Moving forward. So early in the essay, about a page or so in, she does talk about just America's reaction to the new tactics, the new nature of the enemy, in the sense Al-Qaeda, Taliban, is this idea that there has to be, if we're attacked, we have to kind of have this revenge right away, right? And what she's saying is, if you look at military history, it really doesn't offer a precedent to such a misdirection of reaction on behalf of the U.S. military, right? It's not really an effective way of handling the situation here. You look into it, the biggest killer when we talk about interventions overseas is going to be IEDs, improvised explosive devices. And those can be certainly harmful for the reasons of not killing the soldier, but maiming them for life. They have to live with this, which then starts to affect the psychology, which is why we have to have such a let's say, medical infrastructure, psychological infrastructure in place for these soldiers, men and women coming back, who are faced with these life-changing injuries, right? We're going to have a lot. I remember I heard somebody saying this a long time ago, and I imparted as well. We're going to have a lot of compassion for these young men and women who are going to be coming back to us, who already are maimed by war, right? So it doesn't seem to be like effective strategies that we've been waging here, and especially maybe at the strategic level of this, the actual generals themselves making bad decisions, because she's definitely dealing with that level here too. She calls the targeting of Iraq, and some of us lived through that, right? Weapons of mass destruction. She reminds us in this piece, it's here, I don't have to cite it, that was all a lie. And it was a lie shared by at least a couple nations. One, of course, is our nation, the United States of America. Another nation is going to be England, and this was under Prime Minister Anthony Blair at the time, right? So I will admit, I lived through it, but I don't think I knew what was happening. I don't think I understood at that time in my life, whatever I was, teenager or 20s, I didn't understand that we were being lied to. But I do remember seeing Operation Shock and Awe, which I think was like starting to bomb their cities, like actual kind of like targeted attacks on their cities, which were, let me remind you, televised on cable news programs and maybe even national news as well. We just had like some kind of camera feed of kind of the city skyline of Iraq. I don't know if it was Baghdad, I'm not sure what city, but you're just sitting there. I was sitting there just a young kid, like probably like maybe 13, 14 years old, if I'm dating this correctly, just watching the city on fire and thinking my country's doing this. And there did seem to be a kind of buildup and a bravado behind it that seemed to kind of promote this patriotism, right, into this war. And then you come to find out that these claims of weapons of mass destruction and what he was doing to his own people with these gases or whatever it was, or even worse, we're always worried about the nuclear bomb there, the mishandled nuke, right, that came from a bigger superpower. All of that was lies, and she reminds us of that in this piece. And I think if you're reminded that all of that was a lie, I think this piece was worth the read in itself, right? Because we have to be. What are you up against with this new countryless, boundless enemy? I'll just read here. We faced a stateless enemy, geographically diffuse, lacking uniforms and flags, invulnerable to invading infantries and saturation bombing, and apparently, this is important, capable of regenerating itself at minimal expense. We know it's regenerating. There is this kind of unofficial rule of thumb that every drone that kills one or even or more than that, a handful of, say, Middle Eastern people, whether it be in Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it. Every American bomb, misdirected or directed, that kills one of these people spawns, they say, you know, half a dozen terrorists, right? People who are willing to go out and fight for this, be martyred for this. And so it becomes this back and forth that has no ending in sight. And that's always been an idea that some people kind of agree with, right? You can make up your own mind. But now we know it's let's take that at least as some truth to that, right? That people do in the Middle East get inspired by, fighting back against this kind of American military that's becoming less personable, less actual troops on the ground and robots and AI, which are kind of dominating these military landscapes at this point. Back to this, we know it's regenerating the amount of people who want to fight, but now it's also an interesting detail at minimal cost. It doesn't even take them much money, much equipment, anything to kind of get this this buildup going. Okay, very good. Weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, blared across the news, in the papers, on the lips of our politicians, especially because I know, at least this semester, working on with the PACE course with PACE students, some of us are older, and I know we probably, my age, I know some of us remember living through this and just seeing all this stuff broadcasted, right? So it's taking us back to that. Again, lies, 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 right? Moving forward here, this was one of the quiz questions, the tooth-to-tail ratio. This is where we start to get into unwieldy armies, meaning, how much can we really sustain human beings being a part of war? In this section entitled Unwieldy Armies, I think what she's saying is it's becoming too much of an expense to train and arm your basic human soldier, and there might be ways of saving money and effort by using machines, AI particularly, right? She makes the claim here, though I do find it hard to believe, because one fact that was shared by Green Party candidate in 2016, Jill Stein, on CNN, and that's why it was crazy to hear this information, because it was on CNN, which is, very big news station, was that the U.S. military has 800 plus military bases around the world. Some people say probably closer to 1,000 when you start to think about the secret installations that we have that just we don't know about. 800 plus military bases around the world. The next country in line has 30-ish. So it just shows you the overwhelming military power that we have throughout the world. And it makes sense when you think about the huge part of the budget that the military is, which I think can be right around 40%. And they're now in a tendency to keep increasing that amount each and every year. And you can look into what politicians are voting for these increases. If that's something you appreciate, you can see who, you can look into it to see, you know, well, I don't want people putting money into this and voting for this. So there are these crucial issues that all these politicians have to vote on, and we can kind of get a sense of what their opinions are, or at least people that they may be listening to, their constituency. Okay, very good. But yeah, there's but the point she makes here, just to follow up that, the point she makes here is that it could be that the conflicts we're dealing with, especially in the scattered way that we're dealing with them, they could just be too big for our government, right? And therefore things are kind of not working. I mean, she states some statistics here that kind of date back to the Iraq War here when this was taking place, but we're already talking about unprecedented levels. I'll just read, while total U.S. military spending equals that of the next 15 countries combined, I think it's even more nowadays, especially based on the sum I just mentioned a moment ago, and adds up to approximately 40% of all global military spending. So we are spending on military, right? Okay, very good. You know, it's worth pausing for a moment and just thinking like what your feelings about this, you know, pretty massive and continuous military expenditure for our country, like kind of your thoughts and your feelings on it. Because it seems this is one of those issues that are considered, dare I say, deep state issues, right? I know you can use that term in the kind of conspiracy theorist, which was actually a term coined by the CIA in the 70s. They coined that term conspiracy theory. I'll leave you to imagine why, right? They would coin that term. But let's keep going. Okay, the next issue that she brings up here, big point, is just the overall cost providing for medical treatment, ongoing medical treatment, psychological treatment for military personnel, men and women. And this is something that when you really think to the future and think in terms of not only cost saving, but again, human saving in that regard. I mean, one of the pros you can always say with robotics becoming more a part of the military environment than, say, people, is that people will be put out of harm's way in lieu of robots kind of clashing it out. That's one reason I'm very skeptical, and I got students at my high school who are in the robotics team. They do fantastic at my school. They do a great job. But I'm skeptical of that stuff because you look at robot wars and all these things, and maybe it's really telling us what's to come in terms of military engagements, right? It really is going to be robots fighting for our country's interests, whatever those interests might be. There's always going to be that argument, right? That it can kind of save damaged veterans, because as is, we have a lot of them, and they're going to need medical treatment. She brings up that point. Such a big point of irony here. I'll keep it moving rather quickly. Such a big point of irony here, which is you hear a lot of people on the conservative side say, you know, we don't like big government. You're going to, what the next piece that you get into after this is going to be Ronald Reagan's A Time for Choosing, which is a major speech for an American identity, capitalism, a kind of grit and rugged individualism of the American, and a big thing it's going to rail against, which is a part of all of that, is going to be big government overimposing itself into our lives in the minor and the major ways, right? And this goes for the business community as well, where what he's going to advocate really is the libertarian side of things, which is as little government, we talked about this with Thoreau, as possible. So you're getting into something like that with the next reading. But those same people, Reagan himself, you could say, who are opposing this idea of big government, why can't they stand up and notice that when this much money is going to our military, that sounds like pretty big government, right? When government is not even giving people a chance to vote on these types of issues. And that's a point I wanted to make, is that shit. So So even when dealing with people who have that perspective, big government, what Ehrenreich is reminding us of is you can't get bigger of a government than taking all this money and putting it into the military. And a lot of that goes without taxpayer kind of consent. We don't get to pick where our taxes go, right? And they can allocate however much is voted upon. That's why you got to look into the politicians, how they're voting on these things, that a Congress allocates toward a military budget. Right now we're at extremely high levels and they keep getting bigger and bigger. They've always been going up for a long time, probably since 70s, I would say, always been going up. Then they kind of fluctuated a little bit, or just they weren't going up as much, and now they're going up again pretty high from what I understand. Okay. But how can you rail against big government and still agree with a military budget that takes so much of the national budget? Okay, very good. So when you have that conviction that government is too big, and when you never realize that if you cut down the military spending, you'd have more money for lots of other things. Even if you start to slice off just some fractions, you could start to have money for a lot more programs, right? But if you rail against big government and then you refuse to accept this idea that the military budget is essentially big government, then you're going to, that's just kind of where it is, there's no touching that, and now you're going to start to chip away at social programs, right? And this is an ongoing dilemma, which is the military budget soaks up so much of what's available in terms of national revenue, right? So that other programs, education, science programs, clean air, whatever they might be, right? Cultural programs, none of these things get funding because the military is taking it all, right? To add to that, infrastructure, which is our bridges, our roads, and all these things being maintained, created, improved, right? That gets thrown to the wayside because of the military budget as well. And you will hear politicians, not many it seems, but some will remind us that if we do something to curtail the military, limit the military spending, we can do much, 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 much more with all these programs that a lot of conservatives like to say is out of reach because we don't have the money. Well, free up the money and get rid of the war, right, is one way of looking at it. You can Yep. And a good point here. In the paragraph that begins, I'll just read the sentence. It's the beginning of that paragraph. Great idea. This ongoing sacrifice of domestic welfare for military readiness, meaning we give up social welfare programs just so we can have a bigger and stronger military, represents the reversal of a historic trend. So people, and you can go on to say, I think it's Chomsky who also mentions that. Notice when it comes to this idea of national defense, what do you really get back as an American? Do you really get your safety and security back? Terrorism kills less people than peanut allergies in America every year. Do you really think all this money going to the military is the sole reason why you are kept safe as an American and can kind of, like I'm under a beautiful blue sky right now, safe and sound from people around the world who want to harm us? I'll leave that up to you, right? But there is that point that we don't even get anything back from it, right? Billions go into contracts for amazing jet fighters. Does that really benefit me because my tax money is going to it? It's an interesting question here, right? But now we're caught in this trend where we're giving up more in terms of money available for social welfare programs because it's being soaked up by the military. All right, very good. All right, a few paragraphs later, starting with in the U.S., the steady withering. Just providing more reasons why. Providing more reasons why we see this kind of taking away of funds from social welfare programs. And one is because all the money is now going to contracts for major military industrial corporations, right? Boeing, Raytheon, Winthrop, Northrop, one of those. Getting the names a little twisted here. We should know a lot of these because we have a big aerospace industry around here, so we're pretty connected. But they're getting military contracts, huge military contracts, right? And that's where the money's going, right? So when you think about the national revenue, that's where a lot of the money is going, is into these military contracts. And we hear that sometimes these can be a bit excessive. Very good point, teaching me here, and I really appreciate when ideas are kind of mentioned that I've never really reflected on before. And that is that one thing we also have to understand about the military is that it does act as a welfare state for people who have served in the military, right? So if they're having troubles, they can go to the VA, you know, all kinds of issues they might be having. They can go to the VA and they can have some programs to assist them. There's help that they can get, right? So they depend on it. So there's another reason why we have to kind of keep this thing going, at least in the short term, maybe, you know, maybe further into the long term, because there are many men and women, people who have served for our country, which is a very honorable thing to do, and now they need assistance. So we have to remember that as well. All right, so in the section titled "The Fog of Robot War," this is where she starts to get into really robotics stepping into this scene here. And it's sad to say what she mentions here, the way she puts it at least, is when we think about all these robot and AI technologies, the experimental grounds for this has been Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, there's a Metal Gear iteration that is in the Middle East, right? And then you start to see these robots. I feel like they know what they're getting into just in video games, sometimes in the movies too, they say. They hint at technologies, they hint at things that maybe are a decade or two into the future, right? And we'll see real advances on those things. It's scary, right, when you start to see the robots we're seeing right now. So that's kind of a sad thing, though, is to think of Iraq and Afghanistan as these sandbox playgrounds where we test out all kinds of new weapons of war, especially of a robotic and impersonal nature, right? They say that's one of the reasons the enemy can't stand it is it's not a person in that plane bombing you and your people, right, and killing you. It's a freaking robot, right? Because these drones are not just reconnaissance; they are also for real, you know, targeting, and that really leads to a frustration or resentment, which just increases this level of martyrdom, right? People willing to die for a cause up against an enemy that is really can be very powerful and frightening and abusive and effective. Moving forward here. All right. Here we go. Private military contractors. Again, another thing that many games deal with, many movies deal with, right? Mercenaries, essentially. I guess the private military contractor is going to be the euphemism. So it kind of sounds like the guy who's coming to put your backyard together, but we're really talking about killing people in war and security and defense. There's also those ideas in mind. Now, one of the things she says here is there's been a lot of them. This is something that the U.S. military has depended on, is its use of mercenaries, private military contractors. And a lot of these people, as she said, have died, right? Now the problem there, though, is when they come back, when private military contractors, mercenaries come back to our society, they're not a part of the U.S. military, so they don't have the Veterans Association in place to help them in a multitudinous set of ways. So they have to rely on the actual social services, welfare, programs like that, Medi-Cal, that are going to help them get the services that they need. But that's coming out of more taxpayer money at that point, right? So it's almost like we're not playing by the same set of rules. I mean, I think that's what she's saying here. It used to be that the people who fought for our country, and I think contractors are still going to be a relatively small percentage, but still, it used to be this idea that if you're fighting for our country, fighting for our interests, you're going to be provided for here on the home front, and your families are going to be provided for. But now, because we're seeing different people, non-personnel of the U.S. military fighting in these conflicts, it's going to be a burden on a different part of our society in this sense, the general welfare state. Okay, very good. Drones. Crazy to think that they're so remote. I think they have bases in Nevada is a big state, Arizona perhaps, where they have the headquarters of where these drones are actually operated from. So when we're talking about the level of technology that is now in place where you can have people in a headquarters in Nevada programming and also controlling these drones that are flying over skies in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's like, wow, that's pretty amazing, right? That the people who are behind these machines don't even have to be even close to being in these arenas in the first place. She mentions here in 2003, we didn't have any robots. At this point, we have 12,000 robots participating in the war, I'm sure, in all kinds of different ways, right? Some are just, bombs, some, obviously, reconnaissance. They're working on, as they say here, cyborg insects. Again, people, they're always working on the next big thing, it seems. And they're taking a lot of money in order to make this happen, right? You have other big countries, Turkey, for instance, that are starting to fund R&D into robotics and advanced AI systems for the battlefield. So it's not just going to be an American thing, and I think that speaks to kind of the final point that she ends on, which is at what point do humans start to extract themselves more and more from the process and the campaigning and the existence of war, right? This might be a computer game, best left to the computers in terms of strategy. She makes the point that human beings tend to be passionate, emotional, and therefore irrational and can make wayward decisions. She's probably right. I think half the world would probably agree. So if we take that out of it, which can lead to itchy trigger fingers, so to speak, just hot-headed disagreements, whatever, that can really bring the world to the verge of destruction, which if you look at some conflicts, I think it did come down to diplomacy. It came down to the competing charismas of two leaders, right, and maybe some other close officials to work out a way out of what could have been a disastrous situation for many people throughout the world. So the quicker we get that human emotion out, maybe we'll be better off. Maybe we'll see less war. Maybe it'll take it to the extreme. I think she kind of ends with that big question mark a bit. Okay, very good. A little bit about visual AI, visual technology. It's still not to the point, believe it or not, it's still not to the point where, remember she talks about the Xbox, I think, which is really interesting, like the way they start to perfect these technologies, and it comes home in the form of and I play a lot of VR gaming myself, so yeah, it's pretty cool how you can track everything, and the AI that's working in those cameras is pretty sophisticated and pretty regular at this point. However, it's not as good as what we got. Even my camera right here I'm looking at, I'm better than you. And my eyes are okay. I don't need glasses to drive, so that's always a good thing, but I do wear them just to be safe. Our optics are stronger than what AI can produce at this point, can reach. And because of that, it's always going to take human beings as part of reconnaissance missions. So for instance, those drone cameras, when they're flying overhead, there's human beings who are monitoring that ultra HD footage that is now, we're now kind of capable of with all kinds of zoom technology, who knows, right? But you're still going to need people behind those monitors, behind those screens, checking things, because their AI can't be trusted at this point to, let's say, act upon a kind of conviction based on what they're seeing. Okay, very good. They are gathering intelligence at enormous rates, phenomenal rates, up 1,600%. Whew. I can't really even wrap my mind around that, just to say that maybe back in 2003, this just wasn't even Iraq war. This wasn't possible. But the ability to collect so much information, right, is a big use. That's why they're using these drones. Okay, so the last section, I think there's not too much to say. She kind of gets into the, let's say, the legend of war, human beings and our kind of connection to war, the morals and ethics of it. That maybe more and more robots and AI do come to find their permanent place within this arena, right? Especially with these superpowers in mind who have the funding, who can extract it from their populations to keep funding these military endeavors that are probably 10, 20, 30 years just advanced already, right? And we're just getting things trickled out. Of course, that's just me personally, my feelings. But once we extract ourselves out of this and they flood in, she says there'll be no triumphal parades for killer nanobugs, no epics about unmanned fighter planes, no monuments to fallen robots. Meaning that the level of human endeavor that we put into war, right? The strength involved, the courage, the tough decision making, the loss, the sacrifice, my gosh, I could go on and on. What role does that play? What bearing does it have? What need do we have for it now that it's machines who are involved? Do we still champion that robot with the AI, the soldier, right? This is where you start to get into films such as Star Wars and the Clone Wars and everything just one. Do we still find this kind of spirit of human endeavor and, you know, what we can do as individuals and fight and courage? Is it still worth it? Does it still apply? And I think it's a fairly interesting question for her to end her essay on, and it definitely gets us thinking about our involvement in all of this as things change. All right, so that lecture, hopefully not as long as some of the others, it was just covering that piece, and I hope you have a beautiful